I wanted to just share a little bit of my past life with you this morning. I think I may have mentioned last time I was here, Bob and I have been here in the Adirondack area for almost 5 years now, but before that we were in Houghton at Houghton University. I was the chaplain and Bible teacher at Houghton Academy. And I had something I had to learn, and I wasn't very good at this at first. When I first started teaching there, most of the students are not native English speakers at Houghton Academy. If you ever heard of it, it's a small international boarding school connected to the college, and most of the students come from Asia, lots of Chinese students, and Bob and I have had the privilege of raising a couple of those girls in our home during their high school years. They're way more than just an exchange student. They were our daughters, and they are our daughters, and I'm going to reference one of them in a few minutes. But one of the things I had to learn was not to speak using idioms or colloquialisms. I remember one of the first things I said when we had a quiz that was returned to them in Bible class. I said, "Well, you just passed by the skin of your teeth," and it's like, you could just see the confused looks on the students' faces, and after a while I realized I couldn't say things even like, "Well, by George, you passed," or something, and they would look at, "Who's George?" And it was something I really had to work hard at and teach myself not to do, not to use these little expressions that we use all the time and we don't even think about it. But this is a little rabbit trail, but it's an insight into my life. One morning, I was down in my office, and I could hear these little footsteps. This little girl named Jackie was from Korea, very, very poor English skills, but lovely, lovely young lady. I just love her to death. I could hear her running down the hall at her little feet, and she's going, "Pastor Lori! Pastor Lori, I lost my idioms! My idioms are gone, they're gone! I can't find my idioms! Somebody stole my idioms!" And I'm thinking, don't think she knows what she's saying. How do you lose an idiom? So I said, okay, Jackie, take a breath. Calm down. Now, tell me what's going on. And she stopped and she took a breath and she goes, "My idioms are gone!" And I'm thinking, okay, explain to me what you mean. And then after a little bit of time in language issues, she told me that she had an English quiz next period. This was her study hall time. She had left her little notebooks with their idioms to study for the quiz in the locker room, and she needed help going in there to find them. So we found her idioms, and we studied, and she passed her quiz, which was a miracle. By George, she did it. But I often wonder about idioms. I wonder because so many of them that we use, where do they come from? So here's a few that I find myself using now and then. How about this? A drop in a bucket. Another one, bites the dust. By the skin of your teeth. I mentioned that one. A leopard cannot change its spots. Any idea what all of those 4 idioms have in common? A drop in a bucket. Leopard cannot change its spots. Another one, bites the dust. By the skin of your teeth. Believe it or not, they all come from the Bible. Isn't that interesting? And there's a few more, too, that you would know from the Bible. The blind leading the blind. Let there be light. Sometimes we use that expression. The apple of my eye, or an eye for an eye. Gird your loins. I'm not sure I would use that one personally, but sometimes you hear somebody saying, get ready for something, and the handwriting on the wall, or the letter of the law. Today we're going to talk about an idiom that comes right after what was just read this morning. Right after the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." And I have this lovely group of ladies in my neighborhood that come to my house for Bible study every week. And we're studying the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. We started this study 4 years ago when we first moved in, and none of these ladies go to church. So it's very fascinating to teach them really basic Christianity. And we started in Genesis. We did the whole book of Genesis. We've done the whole book of John, and now we're in Matthew 5. And as we study, we've done the Beatitudes now, and we've learned what it means to be poor in spirit, not necessarily poor in money, but poor because people recognize their need for God, and what it means to mourn, again, not necessarily mourning the passing of someone, but mourning the fact that we've disappointed God, we've failed to live up to his righteous ways. And then after those beautiful words in the Beatitudes, we come to the meat of the sermon. And this is what I want to read to you this morning. This is Matthew 5, just a couple of verses, 13 through 16. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. I think a lot of what comes next in the Sermon on the Mount kind of hangs on that idea of being salt and being light. I mean, we've had some lively discussions on loving one's enemy, and how can you do that, and not putting money above God, and how to pray, and all the different things that come along in this wonderful Sermon on the Mount. But we're going to just park a little bit of time here, spend a little bit of time in the salt and the light idea. I hear people use the expression, somebody is the salt of the earth person. And in my mind, it's a very positive connotation. Think of somebody who's trustworthy and honest and hardworking and humble. And I often wonder, why did Jesus choose that metaphor, salt, to tell us that we are supposed to be like that? We're supposed to be salt of the earth people. And obviously, salt in that day was very valuable. It had so many different uses. I mean, today, you walk into like a cafe or a diner, and there's salt on every table. And I know in my kitchen I have a salt shaker on the table and one by the oven and another big one in the cupboard for baking. And for us, it's just everywhere, and it's easily attainable. In those days, it was so valuable of a commodity that it was used as a preservative to keep food from spoiling. Roman soldiers were actually paid in salt at different times. And in fact, the word salt in Latin, which is what they would have spoken, is the word sal. So we get our word salary from the word salt. That's kind of interesting. Salt was used to treat wounds and bacterial infections and skin irritations, stuff like poison ivy. They would rub salt on it. Sounds terrible. Newborn babies were rubbed in salt to keep them from contracting any illnesses or bacteria. Leather was cured with salt. And another really interesting thing is in the Old Testament, salt was a metaphor for a promise from God, because there were such things as salt covenants. Here's a couple examples. The promise that God made between Moses and Aaron was that when the priestly line would continue after Moses and Aaron, they would always be cared for. They would always be paid through the offerings. Numbers 18:19 expresses the salt covenant. It says, all the holy contributions that the people of Israel present to the Lord, I give to you. And this is God speaking to Moses and Aaron. And to your sons and daughters, as a perpetual due. It is a covenant of salt forever before the Lord for you and your offspring. And then Leviticus 2:13 says, do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. I didn't realize there were salt covenants before that. One more that I found was between God and David. And this is in 2 Chronicles. And God basically is promising David there will always be someone from your line on the throne. And that was a salt covenant as well. So people from Jesus' day would have known all about this, but they also had in the New Testament times some salt covenants or salt ideas. It was a symbol of friendship in Jesus' day. Eating or sharing salt with someone is referred to as having shalom, or peace, with them. According to an ancient custom from that time period, a bond of friendship was established through the eating or sharing of salt. If you had eaten a man's salt, you were friends for life. So any of these things could have been on Jesus' mind as he was imploring not only his disciples, but anyone who was listening to him during this sermon to be salt of the earth. God's enduring covenant with his chosen ones, protection from corruption, healing of his people, the purifying of the relationship with God, all of this is insinuated with this idea of salt, and it's all accomplished through having a relationship with Jesus. I had never realized this before, but I came across something that Jack Wasserman, who studied Da Vinci, wrote. As he was looking at the painting of the Last Supper, he points out that Judas Iscariot is holding the bag of money in his hand, but apparently he had spilled the salt container with his arm. The early church father named Origen, who Wasserman says was widely read during Da Vinci's time period, explains it like this: good salt is a symbol of grace, of true active faith in the word of God. And here's Judas having spilled the salt. This would symbolize Judas's loss of faith in Jesus. Wasserman notes that during this moment of discord, Jesus is just about to say to his disciples, one of you will betray me, and Judas's knee-jerk reaction to that is spilling the salt because he knew he was the betrayer. So Jesus calling on his followers to be salt of the earth was a high calling, not only for them, but for us as well. Basically, it's calling us to have a positive impact on the world, to have a purity, to have a moral compass. Have you ever been approached by somebody who asks you, how can you be happy in this situation? How can you be joyful when somebody has just been rude to you, or after you've gone through this crisis in your life, and you know what it is? You know that you have Jesus in you. And that's kind of what it means to be a salty person, to be able to go against the grain, if you will. Colossians 4:5-6 says it perfectly. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. In this passage, Paul is referring to salt as kind and edifying words, and he's writing this letter to the church of Colossae, a Gentile church. And basically this writing, this letter, is telling these people how to act as fledgling Christians, how to behave in Christ-like ways, and encouraging them to conduct themselves in a manner that includes wisdom and grace, and just speaking in a way that would be gracious toward others. So salt is also a symbol for enhancing conversation, the way salt enhances food. So also, just as salt preserves food, we can preserve relationships. That's what it means to be salt of the earth. The world should be a better place because of the Christians in it. But Jesus goes on to say, don't lose your saltiness. He says, if the salt loses its savor or its flavor, can it be made salty again? Now, today we don't think about salt not being salty. It just kind of isn't a thing to not have salty salt. I've had salt in my cupboard for a long time. I think I still have one from my Houghton days in my cupboard, because it takes a while to go through one of those big things of salt, and it's still salty. But there actually was a thing back then in the Middle East. There were places where salt was contaminated with gypsum, and it would be flat. It wouldn't taste salty anymore, and it couldn't be used for all the things that I've mentioned before. So Jesus is probably referring to salt that wasn't pure anymore. And it couldn't be used for anything except maybe to sprinkle on a footpath to kill the weeds, or to be used as dirt to pile on a road or something like that. But it's profound when we think about it. I mean, salt without saltiness is really worthless. It's like dirt. And that would be us. If we're believers, And we're afraid to share our faith. We're afraid to let others know that we're Christians. We're salt with no flavor. I don't want to say we're completely useless, but we're not being used up to the potential that we have. Among the Jews of the early church, there was a custom that was sometimes followed when someone walked away from their faith, but then came back again. That person was made to lay down on the threshold of the synagogue, and they would say, "Trample on me, who is the salt of the earth and has lost its savor." So when Jesus mentioned this idea of tasteless salt, or salt with no flavor, that wasn't good for anything except to be trampled on, people would understand that. They would kind of think back to this custom if they knew about it. The next metaphor Jesus uses is the one that says, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden." Now, Jesus has just finished saying in a different one of the Gospels that he is the light of the world. And now he's saying, you are the light of the world. So, which is it? Can it be both? Yeah, I think so. I think we can look at it like the moon gets its light from the sun, right? The moon doesn't generate its own light. It reflects the sunlight. And that's who we should be, reflecting the light of Jesus. He's the primary light. We're the secondary lights. When he's in our heart, he radiates out of us. Sometimes I wonder if Jesus was preaching this part of his sermon on that mountain and looking out over the town below, and maybe some of the oil lamps were beginning to be lit as darkness started to fall, or maybe there was a full moon that night illuminating the field below. But this idea of light is really, really good. Last time I was here, I spoke about Jesus writing in the dirt when they brought him the adulteress. And it's right in the very next verse after that in John 8, where Jesus says this, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And then in the next chapter, chapter 9, verse 5, he says, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So again, the idea of talking about light and things being lit up definitely was not a new concept or a new idea. Jerusalem was referred to as the city of light for the Gentiles. And if there was a well-respected rabbi in town, they would be called the lamp of Israel. So the religious leaders would have been familiar with this idea of radiating light, but they would have known it as the city of Jerusalem is radiating God's light, and this well-respected rabbi is radiating the God's light, not their own light. It was like a borrowed light. But Jesus is saying, "I am the light." And so he's saying, "I and the Father are one." And he's getting himself in trouble again with the religious leaders. They didn't like that very much. Recently, Bob and I had the privilege of traveling to China. One of our Chinese daughters, her name is Anna, she was getting married, and she asked if I would come and do her vows for her in China. And so her parents paid for our way to travel to Guangzhou. And if you know anything about the country of China, which is gigantic, huge, Guangzhou is one of the biggest cities in the world. There are 19 million people in Guangzhou. So New York City's got 7,900,000, somewhere around there. So it's more than double the size of New York City. And I've never been in such a big place in my whole life. I mean, just absolutely huge. It's almost suffocating to be in the middle of the city and look, just all you can see are buildings and traffic. But they took us up to the top of the Canton Tower, which is one of the tallest structures in the world. And when you got up to the very top, you overlooked the city, and when you got to the observation deck, and you could just look down, and all you can see are these huge buildings and this infrastructure and bridges and highways and traffic and these little scooters down below. That was one of the fascinating things about being in China is it's so busy and it's so difficult to travel from place to place. that people would just order things, and these guys on scooters, they weren't real full-fledged motorcycles, and they weren't electric bikes, they were just scooters. But they wouldn't just travel on the road because they had to get to where they needed to go very quickly. So they'd be up on the sidewalks and up over the stairs and into buildings and down into the subways and the bus stations, and you couldn't walk down the sidewalk safely. You always had to watch out for these little scooters, and they all had little yellow helmets. They had this uniform. And so these little kind of cartoon, some of them actually had little things that would stick out, little antennas and funny little things that would distinguish them from the others with the yellow helmets. But everywhere you looked, it was just like scooters everywhere, not to mention the taxis and the Grabs, which is what they call their Uber, and the buses and the cars. And we stayed in the Tianhe district, which is a very newly established part of the city. The infrastructure there is beautiful, and it's absolutely as clean. You could eat off the streets. It was just, with as many people and as much stuff going on, it was kind of amazing to be there. But our hotel room was up on the 16th floor of this giant structure. And I remember the first night we were there, when it got dark, we had jet lag, so we didn't actually sleep. They're 12 hours different ahead of us. So when it was midnight there, it was noon in our little bodies, we just had a hard time sleeping. So we would just stand and look out over the picture window in our hotel room and just never slept. It was never dark. It was never quiet. And it reminded me of this verse, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. That huge, huge city with all the lights and all the stuff going on. It was really something. When Jesus says a city on a hill cannot be hidden, it's like this idea that he gives us in his sermon. You don't light a lamp, you cover it up. You light a lamp so you can see, so you can make a path for people, so it can be safe. Of course, in those days, it was oil lamps, and they were mostly up on lampstands, sometimes on a hook on the wall, sometimes hanging from the ceiling, kind of like what we do with our lights. But you don't light them and then hide them. You light them so that they can shine. One time we were leading a hiking trip in the White Mountains, and it was for a church youth group. And we went down into a cave. We did a little spelunking, and Bob had a really great idea while we were down in there. We were going to do our Bible lesson down there, and the lesson was being the light of the world, ironically. And so when we got down into the cave, he had everybody turn off their flashlights, their headlamps, and we just sat there in the pure dark. It means very, very seldom that we're in dark with no night lights, nothing, just blackness. And we just sat there for probably a minute or two, soaking in the darkness. And then when Bob started the devotional, he lit a little tiny tea lamp, a tea candle. So it was just this little flame on this tiny little candle. But that little flame was enough to start the lighting of the room. And as our eyes adjusted, we could see shadows and we could see each other's faces. And then as he got farther into the devotional, we handed out little tea lights to each of the students that were in the cave. And pretty soon, everybody's light was lit by the one next to them. And it was bright. And it was amazing how these little lights lit up that darkness, chased away the darkness. It was just such a great example of what it meant to be light of the world. Again, while we were in China, it was a little bit scary in that we knew that we were being watched. I mean, every time we walked into a public building, we had to scan our passports, so we were being tracked, basically, and they knew exactly where we were. So we knew that we had to keep our Christian faith kind of hidden, it's kind of secret. One thing is we don't speak Chinese, so it wasn't that hard to do. But there were things on my phone, some of the apps and some of the things that, maybe my email stuff, I had to take off so that we would not be in danger. Right? We didn't want to anger the communist government. We didn't want to get our lovely host family in trouble. But there's still ways to shine for Jesus, even if you can't use words. You probably are all familiar with the phrase, preach the gospel and use words if necessary. That was the situation we were in. We couldn't, not only because it wouldn't be safe, but also we just didn't speak the language. But it didn't stop us from trying our best to be Christ-like, to be loving and kind and considerate to those who we met. And hopefully that way of shining for Jesus was effective in how we could do it. But that saying, use words if necessary, I think it's almost always necessary to use words. Paul had a great verse in Philippians 2:14 and 15. He says, do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. So just as a primary duty of a lamp is to shine light, the primary duty of us who have Jesus Christ in our hearts is to shine our light, which is his light, bouncing off of us. It's a purifying light. There's no such thing as a secret disciple. Either the secrecy destroys the discipling, or the discipling destroys the secrecy. A person's faith should be visible to all. After we got back home from China, we were asked if we could do a little bit of help with some English lessons to Anna, our Chinese daughter's new sister-in-law. She is going to be starting college in the fall in Australia, and she needed to take an English proficiency exam. So they asked if we would meet on FaceTime with her a couple of times a week and just do some English speaking, which was a lot of fun. We really enjoyed that. And after a while, this young lady whose English name is Hazel, she got more and more comfortable with us. So I asked Hazel one day, I said, Hazel, have you ever heard about Jesus? Happened to be Easter time. And I said, I'd really like to share with you some of our Christian customs and what we are about to celebrate in our church and in our family. And I said, have you ever heard about Jesus? And she said, no, never. So have you ever touched a Bible or read a Bible before? No, we don't have those. And so, yeah, it was shocking, really. But that's how a lot of the students that came to us at Houghton Academy had no background at all in their society from where they came from. There were a lot of Buddhist believers and mostly just non-religious people. But with Hazel, we had established this really fun relationship. So I was able to tell her about Jesus, about his death and his resurrection and what that means for us. And I was able to share through taking my phone and showing it on the Chinese Bible that I have at my house. And she was able to read some of the verses in her heart language. And we're still praying, and she's coming in a couple of months to visit. So, but the chance to share, Jesus gives all of us that opportunity. We're all have influences in different places of work, different places of play, different places as we walk through life. And each one of us has been given that directive. It's a mandate. You are the light of the world. Now go shine that light. And so you will shine your light in places that I'll never be able to go to shine a light. And then vice versa. So we have a lot of work to do. After that, Jesus says, you're the light of the world. Let your good deeds be seen by others so God can receive praise. Good deeds. 2 words in the Greek for good. One just means good as in good quality. That's the word agathos. But then the word Jesus uses is the word kalos, which means not just good in quality, but winsome, beautiful, attractive. There's something just really charming about somebody who exudes this type of kalos, this type of Christ-like goodness. It makes others curious about what makes us tick. It's imitating Christ-like character. Charles Spurgeon puts it like this: the Bible is not the light of the world, it's the light of the church. The world doesn't necessarily read the Bible. The world reads Christians. So it's important for us to be salt and light. they both work really well together, actually. Light and salt are both preservatives. They both hinder corruption. They both purify things, both necessities for life. Seems a little bit like an impossible task, doesn't it? To be salt of the earth, to be the light of the world, but it's our calling, and we have help. We have the Holy Spirit inside of us, because everybody, everything is affected by sin, and the only remedy is Jesus. And so when we reach out to that Spirit of Jesus, which is inside of our hearts, he'll help us with this. He'll help us sprinkle the lives around us with truth and life and point others to a relationship with Jesus. There's one really good example. There's lots of good examples of a salty, light-filled Christian in the Bible, but I just want to end by sharing the story of Stephen, and I'm sure you've read about Stephen in Acts chapter 6. He was one of the 7 men that were chosen to help lead this fledgling Christian church. He was a man filled with the Holy Spirit, and in the book of Acts, he's described as being full of God's grace and power. He had the ability to perform amazing miracles and signs, but as what happens when light bumps into darkness, sometimes there's some tension there. And there were rumors spread about Stephen. He was arrested and he was tried, and in the middle of his trial, his face lit up. He had the light of Christ. Actually physically had the light of Christ, just like Moses did on the mountain, shining from him. He was reflecting God's light, radiating love and peace. Yet he had the courage to speak truth to those religious leaders. His response was not to save his life, but to point those religious leaders to Jesus. He doesn't necessarily go on the offensive. Instead, he models Jesus. He said what Jesus said when he was on the cross. Lord, do not hold this sin against him. As they dragged him out into the city to stone him, those were his words. He was emulating Jesus. And guess what? In his dying, there was a young man watching. His name was Saul. He was listening. He was hearing. And we know Saul, who turns later into this radical, transformed person, Paul, who wrote half the New Testament. I'm sure Stephen's life had an impact on Paul. Who will we impact when we shine our reflection of Christ's light? These metaphors are perfect because salt can't go unnoticed. If you put too much on your food, you know it. If you're trying to sleep and it's not dark and there's a little bit of light shining in the room, light isn't unnoticed, doesn't go unnoticed. And God doesn't want us to go unnoticed either. He's calling us to make a difference. He's calling us to be a guiding influence in a world that's filled with confusion, to be a source of hope in a place where there is despair. We can be a positive force in a society around us by demonstrating the love of God through our words and through our deeds. And that's exactly what we're asked to do. Let's not lose our saltiness. Let's not hide our light, because the world needs both now more than ever. And the world doesn't necessarily read the Bible, but the world reads Christians.